Yeah, that's fine. As long as you put population size and wrote small. Oh, why is that? I don't want that there. Stop. Dang. Okay. Sorry, trying to get this thing to look pretty. All right. So something we need to talk about before we finish up chapter 18. We have this whole thing to deal with that is the cafes for this course. Course and faculty evaluation. You get to do it for all of your courses, and in doing that, you get to assess the way the course is designed while at the same time as assessing the faculty member's contribution to your academic development. Okay? It is a really important thing for you to do for all of your classes. And as a way to encourage you to do it for my class, I'm going to offer the following. So as of right now, the lowest of your 4 exam scores gets dropped, right? That's how it's already structured. The lowest of your 4 exam scores gets dropped. Interesting thing is, the final exam happens to be worth the same number of points as the 4 exams, but it is not part of that arrangement. If we can get every single person in the class, every person, not if you do it, but if every person in the class does the cafe for this course, I will make it to where the final exam could be dropped, could be your drop. And so the final exam would join that as being one of your lowest, which means if after you took your 4 exams, you were happy with what your grade was, you could avoid taking the final exam. Okay? So, yes, Jake.
If we do, say the final is our best score, then would 2 of the 4 other exams be dropped?
No, still just one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, still just one of them. Yeah. So if you do really well on the final exam and you know you're going to do that anyways, then you don't have to worry about this. I'd still like for you to do the cafe, and there are people that would benefit from this, so you ought to, work on their behalf anyways. All right?
But if everybody does it except one person.
Oh, it's not everybody. It's not everybody.
I'll be that person.
At some point, when we get back from Thanksgiving break, I will tell you exactly how many people still have yet to do it. I will not identify who they are, but I will tell you exactly who has yet to do it. Because I can know who has completed it and who has not, but I can't actually see the evaluations until it's done. And unless there's a certain amount, the administration will never release those to me anyway. So let's say only one person from the class does it, and I know who did it, right? Because I can see who completed it. The administration would never release me the findings of that to protect that student's anonymity. You know what I mean?
You won't know what we actually say then.
I'll know what you say, but I don't know what you say. I don't know who that belongs to.
Okay, so you know what we say, but you know who said it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All the time, like, even if we all write it.
That's correct.
If I wrote
Yep.
my name on it.
If you wrote your name in your comments, then I would, of course, know that it was you that did it. The administration may remove your name from it, like what Craigslist used to do when you tried to slip a phone number in there. They would remove it, but now they don't care. They just do whatever you want. Yeah.
When is the last date to take the cafe?
The end of finals week. Yeah, but that'll be kind of interesting if we get to that point where it's like somebody still has to do it. Do I need to take the final or not? I don't know. Yeah.
Are there any bonus points if we take the cafe and the cafe? Or no?
All right. So, next framing question. Oh, yeah, Russ.
What is the final like? Is that cumulative?
It will be cumulative because exam 4 is going to be the week before final exams. It'll be on that Friday before, and that will finish up everything. So there's material from the Monday and Wednesday of that week that won't be on exam 4. And so that'll be on the final exam, but the rest of it will be cumulative. There will be a study guide. Yeah, so there will be a huge advantage to not having to do the final exam. Just putting that out there, right? Yes, sir.
So if you liked your first 4 test grades and we did that, everyone did the cafe.
Yeah, so what I'll do is, right, yeah. So as we start getting closer, I will go in and put a 0 in on your final exam, which will drop that one, and then it'll show you what your grade is with just the 4 exams if you didn't take the final, if you took that as your drop. And then if you're happy with that, then you can choose not to take the final exam. Yeah?
If
if everybody chooses to opt out of the final exam and does their cafe, could we have like a class party at the end?
Well, I have to be here
Okay.
during our normal scheduled finals time.
Okay.
And if there's absolutely nobody that's going to take the final exam, which I doubt, because there are some people that vastly improved on their exams from the first exam, so I think they're going to want to do the final just to take. But anyways, if that were the case, then I would just, maybe we could do a potluck, you know? Yeah.
How many questions are in the final exam?
It will be the size of a normal exam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's cumulative. Yeah, partially. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. I mean, even your other question was fine. I didn't know how to answer it. So, I guess I could have said no. All right. So what is speciation and how can it be adaptive? In order to answer this question, we have to first define a species. And I kind of like to answer questions with questions, and I thought about just writing what is a species here, but then I was like, no, let's actually make it a little bit straightforward. So we have to first define what we mean by a species. This one we've already talked about, the biological species concept. And the biological species concept basically says this: any populations that share a gene pool are part of the same species. Any populations that share a gene pool, they're part of the same species. So if they're capable, another way of thinking about this is if two individuals are capable of reproducing, then those two individuals are part of the same species. Now, usually we add some caveats to this and we say usually will reproduce. So it's not like something we do where we take the sperm from one individual and artificially inseminate a female, right? And then you get a viable offspring. But it's like, no, if they normally reproduce and they form viable offspring that are capable of reproducing themselves, then we'd consider them to be part of the same species because they are sharing a gene pool. Separate populations, but there's gene flow going on, and so they share one collective gene pool. Then you have the morphological species concept. And this is basically like this. You have what's called the type individual. The type individual. It sits in a museum somewhere. And it's like, this is the representation of this species. And the idea here is any individual that shares enough similarities with that individual to outweigh the differences it shares would be considered part of that species. Okay, this is a morphological species concept. So it's basically, do they look alike? Do they look more alike than they look different? Okay, then we'd consider them to be part of the same species. And then the third one that we'll talk about, the textbook doesn't address, actually the textbook doesn't do much talking about any of these, but the phylogenetic species concept. And this is basically this idea. So as you make a phylogeny and you branch it down and down and down and down, right? Like let's say you're doing a phylogeny for a phylum, okay, a whole phylum like mollusca. And then you branch that down into your individual classes. You've got like gastropods and cephalopods and bivalves and polyplacophorans and monoplacophorans, right? All are wonderful mollusks, okay? And then you take those classes and you branch them down into orders. Oh, I forget the names of the orders under cephalopoda. Oh, man. That's terrible. I forget the names of the orders, but you branch them into the orders. And then you take the orders and you branch them down into the families. And then you take the families and you branch them down into the different genera. And then you take the genera and you branch them down into individual species. When you run into a point where you can no longer branch, then that's the species. Basically, the smallest branches. The smallest branches in a phylogeny, those are your species. What's interesting in here is you basically get to a point where every individual population is treated as a unique species under the phylogenetic species concept, which is interesting, but I think there's some value in that because it has the potential to be reproductively isolated. So you might write that down off to the side for the phylogenetic species concept. In addition to writing, it's the smallest of all the branches. What it typically does is elevates every population to be its own species. Every population to be its own species. Yes, sir.
So in the sense of like humans being like one species or not, which one of these like is generally like what we consider like which one of these is used to define humans?
All three.
All three of them?
Yep, All three. Although what you would get with the phylogenetic species concept is if you have a group of humans that are so remote and so isolated, you would actually classify them as a separate species, which isn't usually done.
Even though we could technically reproduce with them if we were able to.
Right, but their population is separate. They're not sharing a collective gene
Or
pool.
something?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So by the phylogenetic species concept, we would classify them as a separate species. Under the other two concepts, we would not.
So how would we define a subspecies?
You wouldn't have subspecies at the under the phylogenetic species concept. You would not have subspecies.
But in general.
In general, how do we define subspecies?
Yeah.
A group with enough genetic structuring to have notable differences.
Okay.
And so subspecies and races are synonymous. And so when we use the term race to apply it in humans, it doesn't make any biological sense. So subspecies and race, those two terms are synonymous. And so, like for instance, we have a subspecies under Homo sapiens, because you have Homo sapiens that are like Cro-Magnon man, which is a different subspecies, and then we are Homo sapiens sapiens. So we are a subspecies within our species. But we're also the only living subspecies. And so, yeah, that tends to be how you define subspecies. With a group of individuals that have enough genetic structuring that they're noticeably different from others.
And that's different than a population in that a population is just separate from each other, and they could have the same exact genetic
Correct.
information.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep, correct. Yeah.
Wait, so what is the other subspecies of human that you said?
Well, Cro-Magnon man, I don't know what their subspecies
Oh,
name is.
okay.
I mean, it may be Cro-Magnon, but it's like, I don't
Okay.
know. Yeah, I don't know what that subspecies is. All right. So we're going to apply mostly the biological species concept because that's the one that's easiest to do. It's just easiest to do. Now, obviously, it has its limitations. If any organism reproduces asexually, you can't use the biological species concept because the individual doesn't sexually reproduce with anyone. So then you would have to treat every single individual as a separate species, and that sounds kind of silly. You also can't apply it to extinct forms because extinct forms don't reproduce. So we're going to apply mostly the biological species concept. And so this is any populations that share a collective gene pool, they're going to be a single species. Now, if the gene pool of one species becomes isolated from the other population, this should say population, but at this point I elevated it to a separate species already. So if the gene pool of one population becomes isolated from other populations, speciation has occurred, and we would define that as its own species. Right, this is where that is. So if a population becomes reproductively isolated, you would say speciation has occurred under the biological species concept. Yeah.
And reproductive isolation could occur whether it's morphological or,
Yes.
or geographic.
Yeah, we'll talk about different levels of reproductive isolation. Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about speciation is it is runaway microevolution. So the allele frequencies have changed enough in that population that reproduction either cannot happen or does not happen. Okay? But just know this, speciation, it is basically what microevolution can accomplish. Okay? This is what microevolution can accomplish is speciation. That's runaway microevolution. So population, its allele frequencies changed enough, it departed enough from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that it just doesn't match up with the other populations. All right, then there's different forms that this takes. The first one and the most common example of speciation, by the way, we see lots and lots of evidence for speciation events. Okay? But again, keep in mind it's runaway microevolution. Allopatric speciation involves some kind of geographic isolation. Okay, so either organisms move to a new place, we would call that dispersion or dispersal. They move to a new place. They become geographically isolated from the original population, and then eventually they become reproductively isolated. Okay? So an allopatric geographic isolation comes first, followed by reproductive isolation. Make sense? There's another type of this, it's called vicariance, where it's not like one group of the population moved somewhere, dispersed, something happened that separated the population. Like some kind of massive tectonic event. Massive, like maybe an earthquake. shifted the land enough that it isolated two groups of small mammals from each other.
Continental drift.
Continental drift. Although a lot of this it's kind of being reformatted, and a lot of that's actually better explained by dispersal. So we use this a lot for, like, if you see species that exist in South America and in Africa, you're like, well, they must have been there at the time when Africa and South America split apart, and then you add the vicariants, and then you get, speciation, runaway microevolution. Although all of those seem to be better explained by individuals from Africa dispersed over to South America, and who knows exactly when that happened. So, another story for another time. All right, parapatric speciation. This happens in adjacent populations. So there's no geographic isolation. They don't overlap, right? The populations don't overlap. They're just next to each other, and maybe there are slightly different environmental needs. You see this a lot with what are called ring species. So you can write that off to the side, ring species, somewhere, right? A good illustration. And so you'll see this with salamander species around, like, the Sierra Nevada mountains, where you can kind of see all these different species, and each one of them is distributed adjacent to the other species. Their distributions don't overlap much, but you can actually see what happened is, at some point, as this species moved around and built these adjacent populations, the different environmental factors led to some different allele frequencies being favored and reproductive isolation. Yeah.
What force keeps those adjacent populations from breeding?
We'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there. Yep. We'll get there. Hold that question. Did you have a question, Anna? Okay. You had a question, she answered it?
Yeah, she did.
Okay. Awesome. And then the last type is sympatric. Sim means together. And so this is speciation that happens within the same population. Within the same population, speciation occurs. So you develop enough reproductive isolation within the same population that some individuals are a different species. Some individuals are a different species. Now, of these three, which do you think is the most common idea of when we actually find a speciation event of being able to explain it? Allopatric, right? That makes sense, right? Geographic isolation happens first, and then reproductive isolation. They're already geographically isolated. They get to a point where they're different enough, even if you put them back together, they don't reproduce. This one is the least common. We have, I think, one good example in animals, one good example, period, in animals. And the textbook talks about it in African cichlids. Any of you ever keep cichlids as pets so you could feed goldfish to them? Cichlids are really aggressive freshwater fish. Some of them are really beautiful. Some of them are not so beautiful, but they all tend to be really aggressive. Anyways, there's a lake in Africa called Lake Victoria where there are hundreds of species of cichlids. And it looks like it was just a lot of events of sympatric speciation. All right. So we still haven't addressed how can it be adaptive. We talked about speciation, but how can it be adaptive? If the force that ran away, right? So if the force that led to runaway microevolution is natural selection, then we would call this adaptive speciation. If it were any other force, we would not call it adaptive speciation. Okay? So only if the force that contributed to the reproductive isolation was natural selection, then it would be adaptive speciation. And if it happened a whole bunch of times, you would call it adaptive radiation. You have that term in the text. I'll show you an illustration of it. But that's only if you can show that it was natural selection that did it. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. Okay. So here's an illustration of probably what was originally parapatric speciation. You have your northern spotted owl and your Mexican spotted owl. At one point, their populations were probably adjacent, and there were enough environmental differences that led to them developing reproductive isolation. And then from there, the northern spotted owl's distribution has spread. And so now you have something that's a little bit muddied, but was originally likely Parapatric speciation. So here's your Mexican spotted owl. Here's your northern spotted owl. When you look at a present distribution, you'll find that they're actually closer together. Anyways. Yeah, I'm going to tell you this. It has a little bit to do with the class. San Diego, the area around San Diego, is the only place in the world where you could find 100 species of birds every single day of the year. Just putting that out there. Do with that whatever you want. So here is an illustration of adaptive radiation where you can trace basically several species back to an original founder. Another great example of adaptive radiation would be the Galapagos finches that Darwin studied and was really overwhelmed by. And so in adaptive radiation, you have to be able to trace a number of species back to an original, and then two, you have to be able to prove that which force produced those species, if it's adaptive radiation.
So like,
Natural selection. Okay.
what like makes one species like more likely to change rapidly, like the finches? Like it's really easy to observe, whereas in some species like it takes longer and harder. Like
Dispersal patterns tend to be a good predictor of what's going to happen. How far can offspring travel, and therefore how likely are they to become reproductively isolated? So if they can travel long distances, then they're a lot more likely to become geographically isolated and therefore reproductively isolated.
So like snails don't travel that far.
They sure don't, and not very quickly.
So it'd be
Although it's,
speciation.
I don't know if I told you all this, but I went and picked up a free hot tub that somebody was offering. They were like, free hot tub to anybody that'll come and pick it up. So I went and picked it up. And then there were panels around it. I took the panels off to access the electrical box, and there were like 20 snails inside of it. And so those snails traveled all the way from here over to Palmdale, which is like 40 miles. And there's no way a snail could accomplish that during its life. But I did it. I took them. So even animals that aren't good dispersers, sometimes we carry them places. You know? Yeah.
And dispersal, that applies to other organisms such as plants, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, plants are great dispersers usually because, especially if wind can carry the seeds places.
And that would cause speciation.
Potentially, yeah. So here is, so sympatric speciation happens a lot in plants. I told you there's really only one good animal example of sympatric speciation, and that's cichlids in Lake Victoria, right? I told you that? I feel like I told you that, but I'm not getting a lot of interaction. I know it's like you're like, Dr. Engel, like I'm flying out literally in 20 minutes, or I'm getting in a car and driving somewhere in 20 minutes. I can't think. I get it. But it happens a lot in plants because in animals, if you have more than 2 copies of the genome, really devastating things happen. Really devastating things happen during the development when you have more than 2 copies of the genome. In plants, most of them are pretty relaxed on how many copies of the genome they can have and still function. So sympatric speciation is common in plants if you get some weird number in the number of copies of the genome. So they can become reproductively isolated, and this figure and the following walks you through that process of how that could happen as you start trying to cross individuals with different kinds of gametes and different numbers of genes. And so they may actually produce offspring that are sterile, but if you keep making these different combinations, as long as you can get something to eventually line up, and the organism will still develop properly with more than 2 copies, you can get something that is then reproductively isolated and it didn't move anywhere. It's just some weird, interesting things happen as it was reproducing with other individuals.
So, one of the definition of the species, if they can produce viable offspring, if
Yep.
they can't, then we regard them as 2 separate species.
Yes.
Would that include with plants? Because you can have a cross between 2 species, they can reproduce asexually, and eventually maybe they would have a combination.
It gets complicated, right? This whole biological species concept gets complicated. So you're like, okay, well, what if we make a new species and it's actually not fertile, right? So it can't produce, seeds, but it can reproduce asexually. Like, you can have a section break off and plant new roots and grow, right? Now you've got some kind of complicating issue. So yeah, the biological species concept gets a little complicated when you try to apply it to plants. But so with plants, we oftentimes use the morphological species concept. If it looks different, if it's approaching life in a completely different, unique way, it's probably a better way to describe it as a separate species than
And
the
that would
biological.
include like nematodes and sponges and
Yeah, any
berries.
animals that reproduce asexually are going to complicate your biological species concept. Yeah, any organism, regardless of what it is, animal, plant, fungus, anything that can reproduce asexually is going to really complicate things trying to use the biological species concept.
And this just came to my mind. If we had something from two species produce a non-viable plant that can't produce sexually
Uh-huh.
with another plant,
Yeah.
what if it self-pollinated? Could it produce something?
Probably so, because the chromosomal number would line up.
So, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Which again that's really complicated, because then there are animals that do that as well. It's technically sexual reproduction, but it's self-fertilization. It's like, well, what do you do with that? So things get complicated,
Yeah.
which is why you don't tend to apply a single species concept.
Okay.
And it's also why ecologists that study organisms as a whole argue that we shouldn't even talk about species, because the whole idea of species is meaningless.
What was it taxonomical significant units or something?
Evolutionarily significant unit. Yeah. You may have heard it as taxonomically significant unit.
Or there's one like OTU or something like that. Or
ESU.
ESU.
Yeah. All right, the rate of speciation. What is the rate of speciation? First of all, the rate depends on a number of factors. One is if you can prevent all reproduction between two separate groups. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You have what are called pre-zygotic barriers. And this means that the zygote never forms. So a sperm from one individual never fertilizes the ovum from another. And so there are different ways you can do this. One, what you would call temporal isolation. They reproduce at different times of the year. Okay? You see this a lot with similar plants where they come to flower at different times of the year. So the reason they don't ever form zygotes is because they flower at different times of the year. The textbook uses an illustration of frogs, two closely related frog species that do this. Behavioral isolation, obviously not going to apply to plants. So behavioral isolation, they could reproduce, but they don't because they just try to kill each other. You see this a lot in small mammals like rodents, where you have two really closely related mammal species and they actually can reproduce, but they note that the other one's not their species and they'll kill it if they get anywhere close to them, which kind of complicates trying to form offspring together. So another one, habitat isolation. So if they're closely related, but they just use a completely different set of resources. So they may even be close together, but they don't use any of the same places, so they never run across each other. Never run across each other. And then finally, if there's some kind of a genetic barrier. So like they may actually try to reproduce, but the zygote doesn't form. There's just some kind of a genetic barrier for that happening. Like their sperm cannot penetrate the ovum of another. You find that a lot in individuals in the same genus but separate species, where the sperm just can't penetrate the ovum. All right, so those are pre-zygotic barriers. The zygote never forms. You also have post-zygotic barriers. The zygote forms, but something happens after that. And that's either what you would call hybrid inviability, so that zygote is a hybrid individual, right? It's formed from two different species, but it's inviable, meaning it never develops. So like the zygote forms, but it doesn't develop correctly. And so it always leads to a terminated pregnancy. The other one is hybrid sterility. So the hybrid forms, it's born, it develops correctly, but it's sterile. It can't reproduce on its own. We'd still call that a post-zygotic barrier. Yeah.
So would a miscarriage be considered?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hybrid sterility, can they actually produce reproductive cells, or is it just those reproductive cells can't
Sometimes.
develop?
Yeah, sometimes. And then you have some that are almost always sterile, but aren't always sterile. So like ligers and tigons, they're almost always sterile when you cross a tiger and a lion, but sometimes they're not. And it's kind of interesting. It's like, well, what do we do there? Like, is this hybrid sterility? And you're like, most of the time, but not all of the time, should we consider lions and tigers to be part of the same species? I don't know. Yeah. But they certainly have pre-zygotic barriers. One, they don't live in the same place. Two, even if they did, they wouldn't get along very well.
It's
Yeah.
a man-made species.
Yeah.
If it is.
For sure.
Donkeys like that too.
Yep. Mules. So a cross between a horse and a donkey makes a hybrid, but the hybrid is sterile. So you would still consider those to be separate individuals. Also dependent on the mechanism of speciation. So is it a gradual speciation where you've got small steps as microevolution is running away towards speciation? Or was it a really rapid series of changes over a short period of time? So you've got gradual speciation versus punctuated equilibrium. Were the changes really rapid, or was it gradual? Now let's think about this. Which evolutionary force do you think is most likely to operate under gradual speciation? Which one is like, selecting against negative alleles and slowly over time, generation after generation, weeding out the harmful alleles? Natural selection. What about punctuated equilibrium, where you have really rapid, really quick changes? Genetic drift, the most powerful of all of our forces, because it's random, and you can lose a lot of individuals all at the same time and get some really crazy differences really quickly. Really quickly. This is why you've got like human societies where you've got some really strange structural and genetic features, even though they've only been isolated for 5 or 6 generations. Got a lot of Amish communities that are that way, and indigenous tribes in various places. And then the last factor that impacts the rate of speciation, environmental stability. Environmental stability. So less stable environments apply more pressure than stable environments. So if these organisms become geographically isolated and both live in really variable environments, you would expect that the rate of speciation is going to happen a lot. It's going to be higher. They're going to become reproductively isolated much more quickly than if they live in a very stable environment. I'm going to present to you the lecture break question that we were going to do, and I told you this Friday we were probably going to have time to have some extended discussion time, and I lied, because we're not even going to have time to do our normal discussion time. But I want to present to you this question, give you maybe like 30 seconds to ponder it, and then give you some ideas as you think through this. The question is this: is it feasible that a single species could split into more than 2 at the same time? That should have finished the question, at the same time. So is it feasible that a single species could split into more than 2 at the same time? At the same time. Give you about 30 seconds, just think that over, and then I'm going to give you some thoughts to ponder about it. Sorry. Do we have the discussion about that I don't usually think before I act?
Yeah.
I always miss. And do I look athletic and coordinated? Don't answer that. Just, think about it. Rhetorical question. All right. So is it feasible that a single species could split into more than 2 at the same time? And basically this gets back to the idea of a polytomy, right? So we have the first polytomy we ever experienced together, right? The first time we ever ventured into these waters together, and it was a little scary, right? But then we overcame it, and y'all learned and developed and grew. You became better swimmers. And so this original eukaryote, is it possible that a single species could split into 5 basically at the same time? And what you're really getting at here is it doesn't necessarily need to be at the exact same time. It just needs to be close enough that you couldn't actually decipher it as you were working in long periods of time. And this is where it gets interesting, because the answer to this question depends on your view of origins. And so, so is it feasible that a single species could split into more than 2 at the same time? The answer is no. It isn't feasible at the exact same time. It can happen in a short period of time. But this is where it gets interesting, is can that be used to explain situations like this? And the answer to that question is yes, if you allow for huge amounts of time. Right? So if we're looking at something where this original eukaryote would have existed 1.3 billion years ago, and this amount of time was 1 million years, what would 1 million years look like compared to 1.3 billion? Right? It'd be like less than 1% of it, less than 1/10 of a percent of it, which would mean that this is feasible, right? It's feasible to explain because it happened in a long period of time, like over 1 million years, but compared to 1.3 billion, it's just like a drop in the pan. And so this is where it gets really meaningful, this question. Yeah?
What if you had like a species and earthquake and they split into 3 different islands?
Well, that would be pretty interesting. So you would need all 3 islands to be geographically isolated from each other, right? So there'd be no gene flow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Is it technically possible? Yes, but I think what you would find in those examples that when you find that where, say, a species or a suite of species exists on an archipelago, a series of islands, that it's better explained by like jumping. Where somebody came from the mainland to that first island, and then a group from that first island went to the second, and a group from the second went to the third. So is it technically possible? Yeah, but you'd need some really nice, you'd almost need to like have some forethought and be like, man, it'd be really sweet if we could split the species up into 3. So is it possible? Sure, but the conditions behind it would be pretty interesting.
So by feasible, you don't necessarily mean possible.
Right. Yeah. Is it feasible? Yeah. Not is it possible?
So
sure.
more likely practical.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, is it a good explanation for polytomies? Is really what we're getting at here. Maybe I should have asked, is this? But first, I wanted to say, like, is it feasible to even have this happen based on these mechanisms that we've talked about? So here's an example from the text that provides temporal isolation. 2 closely related species, Rana aurora and Rana boylii. Man, I bet. There have been a lot of species moved out of this genus recently, and I'm wondering if some of these have, and these are just not their current names. Anyways, closely related species, but they don't reproduce because they mate at different times of the year.
Is the boylii on a liverwort? Looks like a liverwort.
That's it.
It does look like a liverwort. These are organisms that are tied to water,
That's interesting.
like seedless plants are. Yeah. So here, 2 species, closely related species of crickets that are isolated based on their habitat. So they live basically they have the same distribution, but they use completely different resources within it, so they don't ever interact. There'd be another mechanism of pre-zygotic isolation, one that I actually didn't mention in the list, and that's where there's just structural differences that don't allow reproductive events. So here are the reproductive organs from male damselflies, and they're shaped specifically for the shape of the female reproductive organ in their species. So there's just another pre-zygotic barrier. Here's another pre-zygotic barrier, and that is that the flowers just attract completely different pollinators. So, you know, bees using the one on the left and the foxglove, hummingbird using the trumpet. And so the reason these flowers gametes don't fuse together is because a hummingbird doesn't use the other one to get nectar. So here's the couple of examples of the cichlids from another lake. This is in Nicaragua, and another example of potential sympatric speciation. And then here's just showing you gradual versus punctuating. Again, gradual, you're going to think most often or most likely it was natural selection that's responsible. If it's gradual and slow, it's probably genetic drift if you can model that the speciation events happened rapidly. And so in a very short amount of time, like let's say hypothetically you believe that the Earth is not billions of years old, genetic drift is probably going to be your main mechanism for speciation events, which makes a lot of sense anyways because your populations would probably have been pretty small. All right. Lastly, just want to talk about what works against speciation, and then I will hand you back your exams. Simply put, hybridization. When two species come and form offspring together, that works against speciation. So they may be geographically isolated, but life finds a way, right? Life finds a way for them to come back together. And so here's an interesting question. If the species are not completely reproductively isolated, aren't completely reproductively isolated, should we consider them separate species? And the answer to this question is it's complicated. It's complicated. Yes, if the hybrids are less fit. The hybrids are less fit. Maybe if the hybrids are equal in fitness, but rare. And no, if the reproductive barriers are weak. So they hybridize all the time, and the hybrids, you know, are just as good at life as the individual species are. All right. So it's probably going to bother you, but I'm going to hand these back in your Scantrons and then in the others, because again, I didn't plan well. I did not plan well. Jack, Noah.
So when will the grades be on Canvas?
Today.
Okay.
They don't fly well. I know, you know. Be blocked. Whoa. You are very welcome.
So what's your plan for today?
I have work. No.
Yeah.
When are you going home?
Tomorrow morning.
I'll hold on to your exam for you.
What drive is it?
10 hours, but I'm flying.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. $11.
to fly?
Yeah, because we've been accumulating points for like years.
Happy Thanksgiving, those of you that are leaving. And happy Thanksgiving
Yeah,
to those of you
it's
that are
really
waiting
easy to
too.
fly back.
That's super cool. I'll fly too. Where
You're welcome.
airport are you flying?
Sacramento.
Are you directly to Sacramento?
No. I'm flying out of Burbank. We're going to Sacramento.
What airlines do you use?
Southwest.
Anna left. Caleb. I guess she goes by McKinsey, but she writes Anna on everything. Grace isn't here because she left. That's what she did with Missouri. Yana.
You feel good about how you did?
I gotta see on my multiple choice, so. Yeah. It's whatever. This week has kind of just been like
Yeah, it was for me too.
I have one more exam. And,
The end is near.
Charles!
Right here. Thank you.
Where's Jake? Jake.
Jake the man.
Jake the snake.
Jake the snake.
Molly's gone too?
Yeah.
Chad. Joey.
our other parts of the exam.
You're welcome, by the way. You know what I was thinking about? I was thinking about, because I've got another kid that is named Joseph, and I keep using him. No, not one of my children. But I keep wanting to calling him Jacob. You know, the whole father-son relationship.
Well, I have a younger brother whose name is Jacob, so.
Well, the only thing that helped me was starting to call him Joe.
Bottles the foul line.
That's
Was starting to call me Joe.
no, him Joey. And then that's why I brought the Joey to you as well. So I would never accidentally call you Jacob.
Foul tip.
So in reality, you would call him Jacob, but you started calling him Joey. And then
So that I stopped.
so you started calling me Joey.
That's right. So that I would never accidentally call you Jacob.
It's also impressive that this left hand.
Nice.
My brothers,
No.
Joshua, Jane, Joseph, Jessica.
I need to start harder. I just haven't been.
But the real thing is,
Huh?
I knew I did wrong.
Give them some time.
I should do that.
I like that it was
Like I can't memorize like all those instructions at one time.
Yeah.
Did we double our lowest?
Wait, we
Double
doubled
the
it?
highest. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 25 on one.
My dad is my mom is
Wait, so what do we do? We for our multiple choice we double. What?
She
Joey.
made it to an even 100 instead of. Easier now.
technically I think we did the first one.
The whole test is out of 150.
Wait, so Dr. England or Ingle? Oh my gosh, I am so sorry.
Did you call me Dr. England?
Yes.
Oh, that's fine.
What?
So multiply the number you got right out of 20 by 2.5.
Montana.
And that'll be the score out of 50.
I don't know.
And then add the two scores together and add in whichever was the higher score twice.
Oh, that's what I
First you have to
got
get the
wrong.
multiple choice out of 50. So you gotta multiply it
I thought this was
By
on the
2.5.
last
Okay.
exam.
So if you got 20 right out of 20,
That's what I got wrong.
you multiply it by 2.5 and you get 50 points on the multiple
I thought the
choice.
first one, the analytical autopause, I thought that was on the last exam. So I didn't need to review it, so I didn't.
And then
That's
you
what I
add
got
in
wrong.
the best score.
You didn't need to review it.
I didn't think I did.
I thought it was on the last one too, but I guess I just remember.
So whichever one you did higher on the short answer or the multiple choice, add that score in twice.
You had your 50.
I could have gotten the perfect score.
Yeah.
Kaylin.
Yeah.
That's right. Lacey.
Oh, I forgot which one.
I can't. That's right. Because
I need extra because I never know if I got one wrong or not.
No, that's a good way.
that is a violation of federal law.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to violate federal law.
You want me to be in a federal prison?
I love reptiles and
Well,
I know about them all the time. That question was like right up my alley.
Yeah, you too, Rachel. Too.
Well, that's a simple type.
One question is, limited toxicology.
It's like, well, that's exactly what I know. Could have made it better.
You did the whole thing.
And then they roll
A
over.
boat is a very large dog, I'm saying, repelling.
it would get your exams back quicker though, so you wouldn't have to wait. Be late to your next class. Sorry. Happy Thanksgiving. Sorry you're late.
Anyway,
Did Steph leave? She left. Carla's still here.
Alrighty, I'm gonna be going. I think. I'm not
Cool.
gonna stay any longer. You can do it. You can do it. Be
I
positive.
literally am just going to go in there and be like, whatever all this is.
Maybe you shouldn't do. Maybe you shouldn't take so many credits this semester.
Nah, I have to.
No, you don't. Imagine if you scored better. Because here's the thing: is that the different. Did you apply for university already?
No. 40 out of 50.
So basically, all your universities are going to have an influx of
That's true.
applications. You want to stand out. So if you have a better grade, you stand out.
I know.
better. And you're involved with.
Just something that's really